Please welcome our moderator, Vice Chairman and Managing Director of MOLUS, the Honorable Eric Cantor, and his guests.
Good morning. We are very excited to be here. This is the panel on the economic outlook and whether we can actually predict what our capital markets will look like in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. We are delighted to have with us today a very distinguished panel. First is His Excellency Al-Omar, who is the governor of the Saudi Arabia General Investment Authority. We have with us next Mr. Shijin Li, who is the founder and managing partner of TrustBridge Partners in China. And then we have Samir Asaf, who is CEO of Global Banking and Markets at HSBC. The task before us today, again, is to begin to think about what our capital markets mean, what we've been through, the lessons we've learned, and whether we can actually predict what they're going to look like in the future. And I want to just set the table, if you will. We have a situation where we've been provided a very dynamic macro condition. I think in the last year, people have said, anywhere from the International Monetary Fund to the World Bank and others, that we are in a sweet spot in an economy. This was only 8 months ago in the global economy. We now see ourselves with some real challenges, although some opportunities on the horizon. If you look at it and take a step back from the geopolitical standpoint, I know we in the U.S., very much in terms of our economy, look at the increased competition between us and what we call the great powers, certainly the United States and China. We've also seen the resulting skirmishes, and some say even trade wars, that have resulted from this increased competition between the U.S. and China. We also have seen the U.S. growth story, which has been a pretty phenomenal growth story over the last year. We've seen since the incoming Trump administration its passage of a tax reform act, the deregulatory instances that have occurred in the U.S., and what that's also done is bred now some threats on the horizon about interest rate policy. We can then take that and say, hey, well, that's going to have an effect on the emerging markets. What does that mean for our capital markets? So we'll get into all of that, as well as the ever-present evolution of technology and its impact on investors, on institutions that we have here, and how we are dealing with that off into the future. So with that, I'd like to turn to our first guest, His Excellency, again, the Governor of Sharjah, and ask him his views in terms of the outlook from Saudi Arabia in terms of the global macro capital markets and economy. Your Excellency.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Actually, I don't have a crystal ball, but know that the nature of global capital markets are changing and adapting to the nature of the global economy. In the global economy, there are countless investment opportunities for the capital markets, and there are significant amounts of funds seeking investment opportunity. So the important question is, how do markets best find each other? Well, I'll say 3 elements. First is connectivity and access to financial sectors are both increasing, which are important for markets to find each other. The second element, deep and effective capital markets, which are needed more than ever before. And the third element, transparency and predictability for the capital market and business environment. We are working towards the realization of all the 3 elements in our market. And Eric, let me add one more point. I think the capital markets will be impacted and benefit from the disruptive technologies, such as blockchain, AI, and other technologies. And also, I am very sure it will help other sectors to transform and improve in their operation.
Thank you, Excellency. And so you talked about the need for transparency, building confidence on the part of investors, both institutional and otherwise. I want to turn to Samir and ask from the perspective that you have at HSBC, what your sense is of the macro outlook and the kinds of threats and opportunities that you see.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I think that if we look at the short term, we continue to be optimistic about the global outlook, even though we see a bit more cloud now than a few months ago. The IMF have revisited actually their expectation for growth for 2019 and 2020 to 3.7 and 3.5%. HSBC expect global growth to be a bit lower in 2019 and 2020. But if we look at the component of it, actually emerging markets in general continue to be around the 4.5%. So still the outlook is positive. Maybe the two important elements for the short term are, of course, the trade war that's happening between the US and China specifically, but the rest of the world, and what's the disturbance that it will create in the supply chain to the products and to the consumer, its impact on inflation, and its impact then on the decisions of the Fed to keep increasing interest rates. If we see inflation creeping higher in the US, the Fed will probably go higher in interest rates that we and the market expected till now, and that would put a bit more pressure on the US economy for the cycle to turn a bit shorter and to get around the end of 2019, first few months of 2020. And Mr. Trump, by the way, spoke about it even this morning on his tweet. The second element is that on the short term, this would put some real more pressure on emerging markets and the funding of emerging markets, and it would more pressure specifically on the countries with external deficits or countries counting a lot on foreign debt. And we saw the situation in Argentina, in Turkey, but we saw some countries like Indonesia, like Brazil, like India, under real threat in the short term from this perspective. So to be short, in the short term, we still remain positive on the global economy, but with higher risk for the cycle to be shortened. But more importantly, when we look at the long term, we continue to see real growth in the global economy and driven specifically by emerging market, and specifically within emerging market by Asia and by the Middle East. And the point for us, the most important, is the emergence or the migration from lower revenue population to mid-revenue population in these countries, the impact that it will have on consumer, and as well how developed countries can benefit from the growth of these countries in the long run to keep the global economy up and running. Just one number, 2.6 billion people in Asia in the next 5 years would move to a middle class category. That put actually the average wealth in Asia in 2021 only higher than the average wealth actually not the average, sorry, the total wealth in Asia higher than the total wealth in North America only in 2021. And in Asia, we would see actually the mid-class earning double in 2030 than what the mid-class would be earning now. So that represents a great opportunity for the global economy, not only for the emerging market economies.
Thank you, Samir. Shujin, I want to turn to you next. And Samir talked about the incredible wealth creation that is expected in the region of China, in the region that you operate in specifically. And listen, the central role of China is in the global economy is not a new story. I think all of us are sort of aware that of the import and increasing import that China plays. And given the fact that you have a breadth of experience across the growth cycles of all types of different companies, public and private, can you talk to us a little bit about the development of capital markets in China? What can we expect in terms of their real opening up, in terms of foreign participation, and really what is that outlook from your standpoint?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Definitely China, I mean, the policy will become more open. And in the past, personally, I think that China is an easy market and to do business. But the challenge and for the global businessmen and entrepreneurs is a policy, and it's a little challenging to follow because Chinese government, and when they make the policies, because the country is so big, it's a little complicated. So it's not easy to follow the policy. But in general, I mean, because of trade wars and things, China becomes more open. And from the policy, from the central government, they will give very clear signals to the opening of this country, especially in the financial and stuff such as banking and mutual fund and insurance. But the challenge is that, and there's quite a different department and bureau, they need to coordinate and to know the detailed and the policy into application. That's, I mean, for the policy side, definitely China become more open, and we also understand that. Another thing is that from the trend of the population, I mean, this is the most important thing for China is that what's the future and trend of the population. And just now, Samir talked about that, all the Asia, the population change. But in Eastern Asia, I can see the trend, the population is down, I mean, in the near future. And Japan is down, and they lose 2 million people each year. But for China, by 2025, I mean, it's also a turning point for the population. So the real challenge today, I think that China should change the policy to encourage people to have more children in this country, because technology really developed very fast in China. But when technology developed, there from some very large companies such as Tencent, Alibaba, and for certain companies because they also they comply with the international standard. They did a lot of business globally, but at the same time, and they become China and to bridge in China and the other world together. From the policy and from the policy side, I think because we have a lot of company and they either listed in domestic market, on Hong Kong market and the U.S. market. But recently in China markets, stock market is down a lot. I think that's because China is currently in a turning point. And because first is that the population, and China just canceled the single child policy, and now they encourage the family to have more children. Personally, I think the policy will be more open in the future. When the China economy and the domestic market and become very big in the past, but we depends more on the real estate market and infrastructure. But now the infrastructure and the domestic consumption also reached to a point. So now, I mean, to have a more open policy and to upgrade and the consumption of citizens, and it's definitely our expectation. So I mean, China will become open.
Terrific, terrific. Let's turn back to Your Excellency. In your position as the governor of the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority, you've got quite a responsibility and really focusing on how to go about attracting more foreign investment into Saudi Arabia. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that's going, what your aims and objectives are?
Okay, thank you for your question again. Before I answer your question, I'd like to set the scene. According to the IMF report for Saudi Arabia, real GDP growth is expected to be 2.2% for 2018, jumping to 2.4% for 2019. We have a very strong financial sector with high liquidity in banks. Our capital market is the largest in the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey. We have a population of about 32 million, of which 50% are below the age of 30. We are the 8th highest spender on education worldwide. And that's in a real value, not per capita. We will build on our value proposition to diversify our economy away from oil. That's why we introduced Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is a once-in-a-lifetime transformation. The investment is a core foundation of the vision with clear aims, such as increasing the private sector contribution to our GDP from 40% to 65%, increasing the small and medium enterprises' contribution to our GDP from 20 to 35%, increasing the number of Umrah visitors from 8 million to 30 million, increasing our FDI from 3.8% of our GDP to 5.7% of our GDP, all of this by 2030. So, going back to the second part of your question, why should investors also come to Saudi Arabia? Investor always will ask two questions. Is there a market? And how can I access that market? Is there a market? Yes. Saudi Arabia is the largest economy in the Middle East and one of the G20. Saudi Arabia sits at the heart of Arab and Islamic markets. Within 5 hours, you can reach half of the world population. Saudi Arabia has a very strategic geographical location connecting the 3 continents. In fact, 13% of the world trade passes through the Red Sea. In addition, we have the privatization program. We also have the Giga project, such as Neom, Qiddiya, Red Sea, and many other projects. So, yes, we have a big market. The second part, how can investors access the market? We are working with the World Banks to improve Saudi position on the ease of doing business and to be one of the top 20 countries. We have identified about 400 reforms. 40% has been completed so far. And to give you some examples of the reforms that we have achieved, the announcement of the insolvency law, the establishment of the Commercial Arbitration Center. Today, you can start your business within 24 hours using our online portal, referred to as Miras, where all government entities are connected. Also, today you can clear your container in 24 hours instead of 2 weeks before, and many other reforms that we have achieved. We are open for business, and I think this is a golden opportunity for all investors to join us in our historic journey.
Thank you, Your Excellency. You know, with all this change and the growth in population and the demographics, and both in this region and elsewhere, Samir, you've got a global perch at HSBC, obviously with one of the world's largest financial institutions. How do you see the role of your of HSBC and others like it in terms of the growth in these capital markets worldwide?
Thank you, Eric. Well, first of all, I am, and we, HSBC, are firm believers of the universal banking model. We believe that when you have a universal bank, it provides stability for investors because it takes away volatility from one business line to another, and it provides for clients actually a full set of services that come to the interest of the client and not line by line, which basically create some disturbance at the client level. I know that in Saudi Arabia, the universal banking model is not the model, actually, because we have here a split between investment banks, basically per se, and universal banks. But I think that worldwide, this model is the one that has showed its best, actually, capacity to deliver to the economies. Now, banks, the role of banks have changed over time, and specifically after the crisis, because we have asked banks to hold much more capital to support its balance sheet, and we have asked banks to deleverage, and the whole debate about leverage ratio and about capitals. So banks will continue to provide its support to the economy through lending, but banks would be more and more facilitating access to capital markets. And when I think about capital markets, we know all the classical aspects of capital markets, equity and bonds, but we are seeing actually an emerging new type of capital markets. Specifically for emerging markets, we are seeing much more borrowing happening in local currencies, which is something extremely important and provide more stability actually within a country. We are seeing as well a lot of foreign issuers, borrowers coming to capital market. The example of the Panda bond in China, for example, or the Samurai bond in Japan, coming into these markets and borrowing in the local currencies. That is providing actually a much bigger bucket of investment for the emerging markets themselves. But we're seeing as well, and banks are playing a great role in sustainable financing as well, which is a completely new asset class that has started few years ago and is developing rapidly, and banks are playing a key role in bridging the issuers and the investors into the sustainable finance asset class. But let me, if I concentrate on Saudi Arabia, to give you, two numbers. The equity capital, the equity market in Saudi Arabia, the market cap is around 500 billion for an economy of 700 billion. If you it's 80% of the GDP. If you compare it to the US is 140% of GDP. If you compare it to the UK is about 120% of GDP. But if you compare it to China, China is still 38% of the GDP. So you see that in emerging markets, there is still growth opportunities to find equity from markets. But in Saudi Arabia, for example, you look at the bond market. The bond market is only 80 billion, the size of it, which is almost 10% of GDP, while if you go to any other developed country and even emerging markets, this would be multiples of GDP. So what banks will be doing actually is using less our balance sheets and more helping investors and issuers to bridge through the banks, the banks to find actually the source of financing and the investment opportunities. And I think that including in Saudi Arabia, banks will play a bigger role to develop these capital markets.
Very, very interesting. And Shijun, you invest across the growth cycles of all types of different companies, and I assume both on the private side and then as you exit, engage in the public side of the markets. Where do you see those kind of opportunities, specifically in the Asia and the China region, similar to what Samir was speaking about and the opportunities that investors have here in the emerging markets in this region?
Yeah, China is, in the past 40 years, is from nothing to everything. So in the past, it's easy and to invest. And personally, experiencing in the past 20 years, it's easy to invest in China. But by this stage, and I think a lot of things changed. I think the first thing is that consumer is still the key theme in China market. And all the internet company, personally, I think that's consumer company. So consumer and new technology, new consumer, and including e-commerce, is still the trend. But the opportunity become bigger and bigger. And so it's not just small players can play the game. And second, the first is consumer. The second is healthcare service. And the situation is that China will come to the first aging population. And also the aging population, I think they are relatively rich. And for my generation, or the people who is, let's say, around 60 years old, I think they can afford. And especially in the big cities, they can afford for very good healthcare service and retirement home and nursing home. But in China, for healthcare service, it's still at the very beginning. And so the government and open the policy, become more and more open to private sectors. I think probably 10 years ago, there's no foreign capital controlled hospital in China. But now you can 100% control by overseas capital. So I think the healthcare service will be a huge sector in the future. So I think that's consumer and healthcare service that we focus on. And from consumer, also for because related to healthcare service, insurance also do a very fast and very healthy in China market. So we think that the massive consumer finance, healthcare service, and consumer technology, that's what we can achieve in the domestic market. And also because of the accumulation of the experience and in technology and for the massive consumers such as e-commerce and logistics, and China already accumulated a lot of experience and talent. So that's the business can expand into Southeast Asia. Because if we can see that from the population, I mean, the Southeast Asia is still one of the main points, and the number of the population still keep growing. So I think that if we invest in China and Asia, I mean, these three sectors still have a huge potential.
Terrific, terrific. Your Excellency, let me turn back to you. And as we sit here in Saudi Arabia, hearing about the investment opportunities across regions, specifically here in the Middle East, you spoke about the import and size of this market. What do you do as governor of the Saudi Arabian General Investment Authority, and what is that? I mean, I can tell you as an American, I sit here and I wonder, are you akin to our Secretary of Commerce? Are you akin to the CFIUS committee role about foreign investment in the U.S.? What is it, and what are the kinds of things that you look to help promote foreign interest in the kingdom?
That's a tough question because I don't know where to start, but SAG's role within the vision, we are working with all government entities. We're not a regulator. We're working with all government entities to enhance our regulation and to enhance our business environment. This is from business environment side. If I can describe SAG's role maybe in 3 stages as per the investor journey. Stage 1, prior to setting up your business. Stage 2, during setting up your business. Stage 3, post setting up your business. Prior to setting up your business, we will work with all investors in building their business case, sharing all market data, supply and demand, sharing with the investor all the value propositions that we have for each sector, working with all government entities to develop the opportunities and promote the opportunities to the investors, sharing all incentives available in our ecosystem to the investor, and also helping the investor to find the right location. And sometimes we go with the investor to their board to support the investor case with their board in order to take a decision to invest in Saudi. So that's prior. Whenever they take a decision, then we move to the second stage, which is during setting up the operation. Also, SAG's role is to work with the investor to facilitate all the requirements from Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Municipality, all government entities. So it's a one-stop shop services. And we will make sure the investor has a seamless experience during their setting up their operation. Post, this is what we call account management. We will work with our investor for matchmaking because we are working with all government entities and many private sectors. We tell the other companies what other companies need, so we're trying to do the matchmaking. We also work with the investors if there is any regulation that slow down their growth on the business. We will work with the investor to understand the root cause and be the advocate of the investor within the government system to go and try to change or enhance that regulation for the whole sector. This is the post, and it continues. It's never ended. And as you know, 70% of FDI usually comes from existing investor. And very important note here, this is not just for an investor. This is also for the local investors. We are responsible for both, for local investor, and we do exactly the same service for local investor and for the foreign investors.
Terrific. Samir, I want to switch the topic of discussion briefly to technology and disruption in technology. Obviously, an institution the size of HSBC probably has a huge commitment in terms of technology. How do you really see the technological revolution impact your business, banking in general, and ultimately the capital markets?
So what is happening in technology actually is for banks an opportunity and a necessity. An opportunity because banks have a lot of data. It's actually banks who hold the most data in the system. Secondly, the strengths and the increasing power of computing is happening. And thirdly, the artificial intelligence. The combination of the three is creating for bank a huge opportunity. A necessity, the impact of regulation, the interest of getting a better return on capital, because we hold more capital actually, and our returns have been threatened recently. We need to reduce our costs. And because the challenge of the disruptors, are they fintech or are they large tech, becomes a necessity for banks as well. So banks are facing the situation, looking at the opportunities, but from a necessity perspective. Now, when I look about what is happening in the market really, I look at the fintech sector, and I think that the fintech sector is really a huge opportunity for banks. At the beginning, we thought that the fintech would be here to disrupt the banking industry, but quickly we understood that this is a very big opportunity for us because we have people very smart, very focused, extremely agile, and able to deliver solutions actually to our setup quicker, faster, and more focused than us. So the banks, the whole banking industry, including HSBC, decided to invest in the fintech industry, and not only to create value, but mainly to understand what is happening in this industry, if possible, to use the technology within this fintech industry into the banks, and more importantly, to acquire them and have them part of the bank. So the fintech is definitely a big opportunity for banks because it accelerates actually our access to better technology. The big tech is the real threat. So I'm making a clear difference, and the big tech is the real threat. If we look at the big tech in the US or the big tech in China, they have the possibility of disrupting us seriously, specifically in the wealth management area and in the transaction banking area. They have their platforms, they have our clients on their platforms, and they have a lot of the data on these platforms. We have seen in China, the Alibaba and the Tencent actually disrupting the market and getting into the retail part of the market massively and creating a real threat to the banking industry, specifically in wealth management and small businesses. We have not seen it yet in the West for one reason. It's because the regulation for the time being is not allowing the big tech to go into the banking clients actually and to offer banking services. And then the question becomes how banks would deal with the big tech companies. And the opportunities for us is to partner with big tech companies, and you have seen several agreements. We, HSBC, partnered with Alipay in Hong Kong. Others are partnering with Amazon to provide services. The other thing for us is that we will use actually part of the big tech and specifically the cloud area, to deliver, actually to use the cloud, and to unload our data to the cloud area. So it's more than partnering, it's using the services. But the real question for the big tech would be, especially in the West, would they want to come into the regulatory industry, and would they want to be under the regulators' constraint to do the business they are doing? I will give you one comparison. Amazon, I don't know what was the number yesterday, but actually market cap, say it's around 800 billion, 900 billion, for a profit before tax of 10 billion. So just see the multiples. HSBC is 25 billion profit before tax for 150 billion of market cap. So why you want on earth that big tech companies, get into the regulatory industry and be under the regulatory threat with the same ratios but with same constraints, specifically from a conduct perspective, getting into this territory and come and compete with the banks. It may happen, but it will not happen yet. So to just make it very short, the fintech industry is a big opportunity for banks, and we've decided definitely to work with the fintech industry and to use the technology that they are providing to accelerate what we're doing. The big tech industry is a partnership that we are looking to have. And when we are HSBC, for example, we are investing massively in technology, but as all the banks did since inception. So technology investment has not started yesterday. It has started all the time, but it's accelerating, and HSBC has committed to invest $17 billion in technology in the next 3 years, to continue to develop what we have in place.
Fascinating, and obviously part of the disruptive nature of big tech, Samir, sort of the comparison on the multiples, but interesting as to see whether that can really happen or not, about their entry, big tech entry in, or whether they even want to, given the construct that you operate in. Shujun, the fact that you're an investor, and again, in private equity as well as in the public markets, how do you look at AI? How do you look at AI in taking a role in what you do? And I just look at every day, all of us are so deluged by information, different sources, and what we have today is big tech trying to get a hold of what human beings probably can't at this point, this volume of information, and make some sense out of it. And then how does that then turn into investment opportunities for a firm like TrustBridge?
Thanks, Eric. This is a very good question. And because my background is from the internet, and in the past 20 years, I see the development of the internet. I think AI application is already in internet business long time ago. So, for example, is that there's a company called Meituan Dianping, just listed in Hong Kong 1 month ago. And per day, they have 22 million food delivery. And per month, they have more than 30 million in hotel booking. So they have almost everything of your information. You also know Tencent, WeChat, they have everything of your information. They know your habit, and when will you, get up, and when will you, work, exercise. They know everything, your habit. So there's another company just appeared in China. It's called Toutiao. The same thing. They analyze all the data, all your behavior. The first thing is that the easiest thing is that they send the information to you, because information flow is the easiest way. So for entertainment, what do you like? If you see that if you touch one article for 1 time, 2 times, they will just analyze your behavior and offer more certain content for you. So the application is already everywhere in China in the market. So that's the reason, and for Meituan Dianping, they are from food delivery business. They know your address, your name, your taste, your age, and when you travel, you use their hotel system and to booking hotel and also to have cars. So they almost know everything about you. So my observation is that in the future, and the AI opportunity would belong to the huge company, and they own the data. They own your behavior, certain things. So probably government is one monopoly, government can own a lot of information on one side, and then it's a big tech company. And for the finance, and just Samir about the finance, I mean, the challenge is that if you give the license, if you give the full license to the big tech company, they'll be huge. They'll be bigger than current banking system. The reason is that banking, you only know that the wealth data, certain things, but they have everything about you. So, but that's the reason currently in China, so for Alibaba and Tencent, and they take different approach about the finance service. If they got the full license, got the full, support, I mean, they'll be huge. So that's, bring the conflict and between the government and the tech company. So I think that AI greatly will improve efficiency, but it's also bring a lot of issues for us, because when you touch something, that's just example. You like burger, it doesn't mean you will eat burger every day. So the AI is still a long way to go, but I think that it will greatly impact on humans' life, especially for explosive information, for the social media. I mean, for the young generation, they misleading a lot of things. They have good part, they have bad part, but we have to accept that. Terrific. Thank you.
Terrific. We're going to have a final round here, and just to sort of alert the panelists about the question. And the question on the final round really is, as we sit here today and we listen to all these inputs that are shaping the future of the capital markets, I would ask you, what is it that keeps you awake at night in terms of being a competitive player in your respective roles? What do you feel that is most concerning, and you could put a positive spin on that as well, or what do you think you may miss in terms of an opportunity? So again, what is it that keeps you awake at night as we look at this future before us? And Your Excellency, I turn to you as, again, Governor of Saggia.
I think the disruptive technologies, this is something very important. This is where sometimes it keeps you awake. You don't want to miss any opportunity. As a government, what we need to make sure we enable the new technologies to support other sectors, is not to kill the new technologies. The business model is changing. It's not anymore the traditional way of doing business. We have seen, for example, Uber. They changed the the transportation sector method, and the business model is changing completely. The banking system, now we start to hear online banking. They don't have any physical location. It's all online. So in summary, I think we need to make sure we enable all the new technologies that we think it will support and enhance other sectors.
All right, so Samir, we're going to go to you. His Excellency says disruptive technology keeps the governor awake at night.
Well, my constant thinking is how to continue to keep the banking industry safer to the benefit of all the stakeholders. And when I say safer, I mean how can we continue contribute positively to the society, but how as well can impeach financial crime from getting into the banking industry, and how we make sure from a conduct perspective we deliver the best products for clients, within the best service.
Shujin, last word. What keeps you awake at night as you look forward in the capital markets?
I mean, finally that because technology and economy serve human beings, how about, the future of the change of the population?
Terrific. Well, thank you. Please join me in giving the panelists a tremendous round of applause. You were terrific. Thank you.